What would it look like if we embraced each other in our life together as the Church of the Brethren? What would it look like if we shared unconditional love with those who, like all of us, have made mistakes in our life? What would it look like if we reached out and found common ground with someone who sees things differently than we do? What kind of a church would we have? Can we change our own self-assigned job description that includes correcting each other's theology or beliefs or interpretation of biblical concepts, and pay more attention to proclaiming the life-changing gospel of Jesus Christ? The same Jesus who changed his plans that day in Jericho and chose to share the message of God's salvation with Zacchaeus. What would it look like and feel like to imitate Christ's gift of love for us in today's world? Will it be messy? Could it involve mutual discernment, discussion, dialogue, and remaining in fellowship throughout the process? Could it go on forever? Could perfect resolution never be accomplished to anyone's liking? I wonder. If we take Jesus' plea for unity seriously, and the Apostle Paul's directive to embrace, accept, or welcome each other seriously, could it be that it's accomplished to God's liking? I pray one day we'll find out.
Hum, 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 hum. We kneel together, we bow as one, we raise our voices to God above. Free all your people, make all things new. You're our Redeemer, we worship you. Sing with me. We kneel together, we bow as one, we raise our voices to God above. Free are your people, make all things new. You're our Redeemer, we worship you. We kneel together, we bow as one, we raise our voices to God above. Free all your people, make all things new. You're our Redeemer, we worship you. We kneel together, we bow as one, we raise our voices to God above. Free all your people, make all things new. You're our Redeemer, we worship you. We kneel together, we bow as one, we raise our voices to God above. Free all your people, make all things new. You're our Redeemer, we worship you. We kneel together, we bow as one, we raise our voices to God above. Free all your people, make all things new. You're our Redeemer, we worship you. We kneel together, we kneel together, we kneel together, we kneel together. Hum, 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 hum.
The 2022 Church of the Brethren Annual Conference met live on the banks of the Missouri River in Omaha, Nebraska. It was the first gathering of the Church of the Brethren in person for the big meeting in 3 years due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Hello, this is Brent Carlson. Welcome to Brethren Voices. Over 1,300 people attended the conference, including some who attended virtually. We'll share the spirit of this event with video and music, including an in-studio appearance of John Jones, who, as a delegate, made the trip to Omaha. John Jones, welcome to Brethren Voices.
Thank you.
Was this your first trip to Omaha? What was it like?
It was the first time I had ever been to Nebraska in my life, and I was very pleasantly surprised. Omaha is a really nice city, and it's quite diverse, both racially and ethnically, and it seemed to be a very welcoming city. And as you said, it's on the banks of the Missouri River, and I have some family heritage that goes clear back to my grandfather meeting my grandmother on the banks of the Missouri River in Nebraska. So that was a special note of our time there. Yeah, it was a fun time. Although I was ill at the time, it was fun and very educational and a good time for everybody. It was uplifting.
I also understand that wearing masks was mandatory. How was that accepted?
At first, there were people apparently within the Church of the Brethren gathering who kind of thought, why do we need to do this? But they didn't act that way later. They were very cooperative. There had been a group there before the Brethren where there had been a major outbreak of COVID-19, and the convention center had been completely aired out. There was an air exchange, which I guess is a pretty big deal. But the Brethren were very responsible. People wore their masks. There wasn't any kind of protesting or anything like that. They were very, very responsible, and they did not have any kind of an outbreak. There were some cases that were detected, but it was well under control.
When the annual conference visits a city, there are some traditional things the Brethren always do. They pay tribute to the lands and its people of the place they are visiting.
As we gather here in Omaha on the banks of the Missouri River, we would like to acknowledge with gratitude that we gather on the traditional land of the Omaha Indians, meaning upriver people or those going against the wind or current. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it for generations. 28 American Indian tribes still utilize the Missouri River today to gather power, resources, and to sustain life. A plaque on the pedestrian bridge that crosses over the river into Iowa directly behind the convention center says, "Going against the current brings knowledge of our strength as living entities coexisting with a power we do not quite understand." Isn't that the sentiment at the heart of our own commitment to nonconformity as brethren? This was and is holy ground for our American Indian brothers and sisters. And this is, as we gather for worship and for fellowship and for business, holy ground for us.
Omaha is also a city marked by the violent tragedy of an anti-Black riot, when a large mob, unable to accept an increasing call for racial equality, took justice into their own hands. On September 28, 1919, that mob stormed the courthouse to seize Will Brown, a Black man accused of assault. They ultimately captured, killed, and afterwards continued their violence against Will's lifeless body. We mourn this moment of injustice and the ongoing racial injustice so many of our Black brothers and sisters experience around the country. As is true in so many places around the world, these aspects of Omaha's histories are emblematic of scars and continuing tensions in our society. The only way to move forward is to acknowledge the painful past and to commit ourselves to a more just future. May our presence here this week bear witness to the good news of God's justice and peace.
The conference always has a blood drive for the local community, and the Brethren provided funds of nearly $13,000 for Girls Incorporated of Omaha, which empowers girls ages 5 to 18 to achieve in their neighborhoods. John, last year you attended the conference as a delegate, virtually, and this year you attended in person. Can you tell us about the experience as a virtual attendee versus in person?
Well, last year I had never been a delegate before, but I was incredibly impressed with the fact that the Church of the Brethren could pull off a virtual conference that large and even have round table discussions. We had 6, 8 people at a table and pulled it off virtually, and it was a very personal event, even though it was virtual. But this year, and again at round tables of 6 or 8 people, and I was a facilitator last year, and again this year I was a facilitator. It was just more personal, more intimate, even though I was very impressed last year. And the thing that impressed me most about our roundtable conversations, and for that matter, the other nearly 450 delegates, there were 1,300 people at the conference or more, but the delegates who were in the business meetings along with me, I had this feeling that there was this very strong, sincere desire to discern the will of the Spirit among us, and not have it be our agenda, but rather something that came from the Spirit to help us make wise decisions together. That was a very definite feeling that I had. And like other organizations and religious organizations included, you know, the Church of the Brethren has had its own times of tension, differences of opinion on all kinds of things in its history, and it isn't any different today. However, there's this very strong desire that I felt personally at the conference this year of wanting to work together to discern the will of the Spirit. And that's really an amazing thing. It's something to feel good about being part of.
Were other people talking about being filled with the Spirit in the community of the conference?
It wasn't so much something that they stated as something that they were. Mm-hmm. Wow. It was a presence. It was a knowing for me personally. And I'm not talking about being filled with the Spirit in a charismatic kind of way. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about an intentional desire to embrace one another, even with our differences. In fact, the theme of the conference was embrace one another as Christ embraces us. And so, and that seemed to me what really happened.
The annual conference of the Church of the Brethren is packed with much activity, including basic gathering of people from all over the country. Numerous international congregations have been attracted to the church, with Nigeria having almost twice as many members as the church congregations in the United States. What did you find compelling about that at this gathering?
For one, the different styles of different ethnic backgrounds and national backgrounds was impressive to me. In terms of Latin American worship, it was much more charismatic, if you like, in a sense. And then one of the ministers from Spain really impressed me, that he was very, very calm and well-spoken in the sense of knowing what he was talking about, and also just his sincerity. It just came through so strongly, and I think that's kind of European kind of influence. And then of course, African worship styles and speaking styles and all, and the music was varied, you know, from African culture and South American, Latin American culture, and European culture, and of course our own nation's culture, and places like Puerto Rico and what have you that we have here as our own culture. The variety and the personal expression of individual cultures. We were all united in the sense we were all one body, but the individual expression of culture as a form of worship and a form of the body of Christ was really impressive to me. I loved being part of that.
The worship services each night provided a great deal of variety in music, drama, and sharing of stories. We wanted to share the story of Cliff Kindy, who has been a member of the Christian Peacemaker teams. The peacemaking teams travel to some very dangerous places to provide aid and comfort to people who are persecuted.
Luke reports the story. A lawyer stood up to test Jesus. It was March 2003. 50 of us from Christian Peacemaker teams and Voices in the Wilderness were together in Baghdad. We had been there in Iraq for 5 months. We were asking the question, what would it take to stop a war? 10 days into the bombing, we were kicked out by the Iraqi Mukhabarat. Kathy intervened for us so we didn't have to go through the night where the war was ongoing in the Western Desert. We left the next morning, 3 cars in a caravan, heading fast 300 miles to the Jordanian border. Along the way, we could see the burned out chassis of pickups and buses along the road, bridges hanging because they'd been hit by missiles. At one point, the 3 eastbound lanes, a huge crater where a bomb had hit. U.S. fighter jets were still in the air. We hit Rutba in the Western Desert, the only population center. And probably as we were passing a bus, on the left lane, we picked up probably shrapnel. It was 4 kilometers down the road. The left rear tire blew. We were in the ditch, which would have been fine, except there was this huge abutment at the end of the ditch. We hit that abutment. The 5 of us in the car were injured. The other 2 vehicles didn't look back for another 45 minutes until they hit the Jordanian border. We were there alone. 5 of us in the car were injured. As we were scrambling out of the car, an eastbound Iraqi driver stopped, yelled across the median, "How can I help you?" He took us back into Rutba. It was like a first aid center, and after 13 years of sanctions, with no medical supplies coming in, it was pretty primitive. But as they opened their doors, they said, "Doesn't matter whether you're Iraqi or American, we'll take care of you. It doesn't matter whether you're Muslim or Christian, we'll take care of you." They were doing triage, and when they got to me, the doctor explained that 3 days ago, the U.S. pilot had bombed and destroyed his children's hospital there in Rutba. I'm alive today because somebody who would have seen me as the enemy said, "I'll take care of you." Luke's story concludes with Jesus asking, "Which of these proved neighbor to the one injured at the side of the road?"
David Sollenberger was this annual conference moderator. Right off the bat, he made changes involving the gavel, which is often used at annual conference. John, tell us what happened about the gavel.
Well, David Sollenberger is a man probably similar in age to me. He's has had a lot of influence in the Church of the Brethren over the years through creation of stories, through video presentations, filming. That's one of his gifts to the church. He's also been very influential in terms of his humor and the way he can communicate with a very subtle sense of humor that tends to bring out the best in people. Mm-hmm. And he started off the conference by picking up this gavel, or one of the first things he did. He picked it up and he looked at it and he said, I don't know what this thing is. Maybe one of the workers left it behind. I don't know why they'd be using a hammer like this, but I'm going to put it over here. And he never touched that gavel the rest of the conference. And I feel that that was a brilliant nonverbal communication to people, that the way he looked at leadership was that we are all equal. He's not going to use power over others. This power of the gavel isn't something that he's going to involve himself with. And that was an example of leadership that, to me, set the tone for the whole conference. It was a tone of cooperative empowerment, and I really liked it.
And he was consistent with that throughout.
He was very consistent with that. And he had a great gift with his humor and with his gentleness to bring people together, particularly on issues that might be divisive in some way, and they weren't, greatly because of his leadership. And I mentioned Belita Mitchell earlier, the woman who preached on the meeting of Jesus and the woman at the well. Well, Sollenberger also talked about Zacchaeus, who climbed the tree, the tax collector guy, and how Jesus deliberately reached out to embrace him. And this idea of embracing one another as Christ embraces us really came through in Sollenberger's leadership. And as I said before, the whole kind of tone of the conference, it felt good.
The Southern Ohio and Kentucky district brought a query to the annual conference to consider and deal with diversity in the church and stand with people of color. John, tell us what happened with the query.
Well, first of all, the question was, how can the church support people of color and people who are suffering the consequences of systemic racism, people at the border, the stranger who isn't being welcomed? How can we as a church stand with people of color and work against systemic violence, or systemic violence and systemic racism, racial type violence, so that all can be truly free and equal? And the neat thing, other than the fact that the conference affirmed that query, that is something we should be doing as a church, the really neat thing is that On Earth Peace, which is one of the agencies of the Church of the Brethren, is asked to work in the coming year with the Southern Ohio, Kentucky district and the Greater Church of the Brethren to talk about how they will implement, what they will do, and how they will implement those efforts to stand with people of color. And it was wonderful to just, when the final vote came, whether we go ahead with this or not, I didn't see one hand that was in opposition. I mean, it was a unanimous declaration of the fact that people in the church wanted to stand for justice and not sweep issues under the carpet kind of thing.
What will you remember from your experiences in Omaha?
Well, one of the things I will remember, I think, above many of the other experiences, was a sermon by a woman who is from one of the churches in Pennsylvania, and she spoke about the story of the woman at the well and Jesus having their conversation, and the point that she was making was that we have to intentionally reach out to others who are different from ourselves, in whatever ways that might be, and desire to be in relationship with them and be Jesus in the neighborhood to them and receive that same kind of offering from them toward us. And the woman at the well, that's one of my favorite stories, and she just told it so well, and she also made the point that as a denomination, the Church of the Brethren needs to be about seeking out relationship, embracing those who are different from us. And I saw that in terms of, in the past, in the Church of the Brethren and many denominations, there has been a resistance among many people to welcome and affirm and empower LGBTQ friends, brothers and sisters, and the denomination of the Church of the Brethren hasn't been any different in terms of having tensions around that issue. But we are struggling with it, and we are working on it, and it impressed me that somehow there is a feeling right now that even though we're still struggling as a denomination, and there are those that are still having difficulties with that whole issue of welcoming and affirming, there are some big changes going on, and it was to some degree an intuitive sense on my part, but in other ways it was very specific. We have 3 leaders in the Church of the Brethren right now who are moderators. This year's moderator, David Sollenberger, who was elected last year, and he's an incredible guy who's very open and affirming. A second person named Tim McElwee, who is the new moderator-elect for this year, and he will oversee the conference next year. And then another person who was elected this year as moderator-elect, her name is Madeline Metzger. She's a younger woman, about 44, mixed race and mixed ethnicity, and all 3 of these people are from open and affirming congregations. And that to me is a really strong indication that we have trustworthy leadership and leadership that is not afraid to embrace diversity and welcomes diversity. So that was probably the greatest thing for me about this whole conference, was that it seems to me there's a sea change going on, and I'm hopeful.
I think, as I recall, we're called to love our neighbor as ourselves. And I don't think there was a lot of limitations on who's our neighbor.
Yeah, I think that was Jesus's point.
Was it? Oh. I'll be darned. John Jones, we thank you so much for being with us on Brethren Voices.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you very much.
For Brethren Voices, this is Brent Carlson.
And John Jones, wishing you peace.
1% at a time in a world so much needing peace.